So again, we're starting Chapter 4, and the first thing that's in here is how to use the window and document objects. You've used prompt, you've used alert. You've used both those already, all right? And saying prompt like this or alert is the same thing as saying window.prompt or window.alert. Since the window object is given to you by default, you don't need to say it. That's the first thing they're saying in here. However, when you use the document object, you must say document.something. The one you'll use the most often is either document.write or document.writeLine, LN. And that will allow you to write something on a web page. So if we look at some of the examples that are in here, now we didn't go through this. You've done an alert, but see this? There's also a confirm, which works pretty much just like an alert. Except I think that instead of OK, cancel, you get like yes, no. I don't remember what it is. I don't ever use it. All right. The parse int and parse float, I don't think we have to talk about anymore. My hope is that everybody gets them. One thing I have not done with you, if you look at this, you look at the examples that are up near the top, you don't have to put parse int and parse, you don't have to put a parse and a prompt together. You could have them as two different statements. All right. I was showing them to you always as one statement. So where they are putting them as two here and here, we've done parse int and then put the prompt inside of it. All right. Is there an advantage? It's going to run a little faster the way I showed you. But if that makes more sense to you, then do it like that. All right. Now, what's new in here, and we've talked about it a little, but we're going to actually see it in action, so to speak, in this chapter, is the get element by ID. We're going to start creating forms. All right, we're going to start creating forms, and our forms that we create, the alert's going to go bye-bye for lack of better words, and so is the prompt. Anything that you want the user to input will be shown on the form. Anything you want to output will also be shown on the form. We're going to do it like that. Why? Because that's the way it's done. All right? So you're going to see this. Anything that you put on a form, really anything you put on a web page that you give an ID to, you can use that get element by ID. The unfortunate thing, so to speak, about that is it's a little quirky. Sometimes you've got to do things and sometimes you don't. I didn't make the rules. It's the best thing I can tell you. All right? When we get into Chapter 6 next week, we will be talking about the DOM, the Document Object Model. 4 and 6 really go together, those two chapters. All right? They also talk about in here NAN. You know what that is. I just went over get element by ID, so you know what that is. How to use text box and number objects. Couple things. If you look up on the screen, everybody, please. Notice focus. The first one that's there. If you set the focus to something, that's where the cursor is. Typically, you will set the focus, if you've got a form, to the first element where somebody has to enter information into a form. You don't have to put it there, but that's usually what people do. All right? When you put something into a text box, if you want to pull it out, you use its value. You'll see that in just a minute. All right? If you don't want to allow somebody to put something into a text box, okay? Maybe, for example, maybe you've got a form up and you've got something in there about ordering I don't know, ordering your cap and gown for graduation from Rankin. All right? But the first thing we ask is what year in school are you? And if you put first, then that thing for ordering cap and gown, it's going to be grayed out because you don't graduate until the end of your second year. Does that make sense? So you could disable it. Just the first thing that came to my mind. Maybe not a great example, but it's just an example nevertheless. The two fixed we've looked at. So notice this. Okay? They show you this twice. Here it is 2 lines. Document.getElementById. So someplace on a form, you've got an element named first name. Everybody see that? So you're going to grab whatever's in there, and you're going to assign it to first name, but you want its value. You typically wouldn't do this as 2 lines, you do it as 1 line. Notice there's document.something else. That's called chaining. Chaining becomes really important in about 3 or 4 weeks from now when we look at jQuery. Because in jQuery, you chain everything. You might have something 8 times. All right? So there's parse float. Again, we've looked at that already. There's just some examples we've already looked at. All right? When you assign a numeric value to a variable, a number object is created. But to convert it over, you do a parse int or a parse float. We've already looked at both of those. Dates and strings, I will just tell you if you look up on the screen for a second here, strings are a big thing to work with in here in any programming language. And this is one of the best tutorials, the one on strings, that I've ever seen. Because if you go down to it, what it does is it shows you examples, and then, come on, keep coming, come on. Someplace in here, there it is. It shows you every single string method there is. All right, again, I sent you the URL, and you can get to this from the URL I sent you. All right. Now they say how to use date and string objects. Anybody remember this? Number, string, offhand now I don't know, and Boolean basically. Those are the types of objects we've talked about before. We've talked about Booleans, true, false. We've talked about numbers, which can have a decimal but don't have to. We've done some work with strings, which have to be in double quotes or have to be in single quotes. The weird thing about JavaScript is there is no date data type. Dates are strings. That's the bad news. The good news is, even though they're strings, you can manipulate them. There are different functions or methods you can use with a date. If you look on page 117 here, I'm not going to go through these examples. You can take a look at them. All right? But you can grab just the year, just the month, just the day. The weird thing about some of this stuff, if you grab the month, for example, January is 0. Everybody hear that? That's the mistake most people make. So this month right now being, what, October, the end of October, this would be month 9. So if you want to reference it, you usually say that get month plus 1. All right? Some of the string stuff, this is, again, I just showed you that on Hunlock. They've got examples of all these. Those last two make sense. 2 lowercase and 2 uppercase. It's going to convert everything to lowercase or to uppercase. All right. Substring or sub-str, that's going to find a string within a string. So maybe when Lincoln did his Gettysburg Address, he said 7 years ago a lot of times. I don't think he did, but let's just say he did. If we wanted to count, we could look for the substring, which would be 7 years ago, inside of the regular string, which would be the entire Gettysburg Address. All right? Substrings are really important in programming, though, to allow you to search through something for something else. This is a real good spot to stop how to use functions. All right, so I'm going to give you a handout. It'll be on your desks when you get back. It's 9:49. Please come back at 10:05. All right, it's a little early, but let's finish this up so you can have hopefully a good hour today to sit and work on homework. Page 118 starts talking about how to use functions. There's two ways that you can use functions, at least. And what we're going to talk about today are named functions. A named function, shouldn't be a surprise, is a function that has a name. Tomorrow we'll look at anonymous functions. Anonymous functions do not have a name. Some books will call them unnamed functions. A function is ideally a block of code that does one job. In an ideal world, if I was asking you for 10 pieces of information, first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, etc., if there were 10 of those pieces of information, in an ideal world, I'd write 10 different routines. That's not realistic. That's not real life. Most people would put that into one routine, even though there's 10 things that are being asked for. All right, but in a truly modular program, every function that's in there does one thing. All right. All right. When you do a function, this is what's kind of weird about this language. If you look at this, you've used var before. Var means variable. A function in JavaScript can be used like a variable. So in other words, this says grab all that info, do whatever's in here, take the results of it and put it into the variable called showYear. So that's what's called a function expression. We're going to look at those tomorrow. I thought it would be easier to just show you non-function expressions today because they're easier to work with. All right? So we'll be looking at these tomorrow. All right, the program that I gave you before the break, we're going to look at it in just a couple minutes, but I'm going to rewrite it between today and tomorrow to take everything that's in there and I'm going to put it inside of an HTML. Well, basically the code will still be in a JavaScript code, but we're going to have it where it's going to run on an actual web page. In other words, the web pages we've been using thus far for JavaScript have just had a button in them that said run program. Not anymore. All right. All right. They talk about declaring functions. These are the kind of things that we're going to be looking at in just a minute. When you declare your own function in JavaScript, it's function followed by the name of the function, and then all the code for the function goes inside of curly braces. All right? And notice this is a function that's called showYear. This is what's known as a function call. So I am calling function showYear right there. All right, that's what we're going to look at in just a minute. Now, I showed you this much earlier in the semester. This right here is what's referred to typically as an alias. This says, I don't want to say document.getElementById followed by something. I want to just use a $sign. So this line right here, this function that we put right there, that function, allows us to do this. And again, you might say, well, big deal. If you didn't have that there, you'd have to type in var email address 1 equals, and you'd have to say document dot get element by ID email underscore address 1 dot value. So now what we've said is this is an alias for this. So I can write this as opposed to having to write that. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. You'll almost always see that in any JavaScript program that's going to manipulate the document object model or the DOM, which is what we're starting to do right now. All right. This is the kind of thing that we're going to look at today, this example that's right here. Function calculate tax. Here we're passing in two variables, subtotal and tax rate. And we're creating a new variable here called tax. So if our subtotal was $100 and our tax rate was 5%, then tax would be 100 times 0.05 or $5. Then we are setting it to 2 decimal places and returning it. All right. This is really the only difference between what we have been doing and this is rather than doing everything in one big routine, we're breaking it up into a bunch of smaller routines. The code and the logic does not change. All right. This a little bit difficult possibly to understand, but I want you to understand it. Please look up on the screen here. All right. This is one of those unnamed functions that we'll talk about tomorrow. But notice, curly brace here, curly brace right there. Inside of here, we're creating a variable. Since we are creating a variable inside of a function, it's called a local variable. It's local or only known by default to that function. So if I come out here and try to say this, outside of the function, I get an error. And it'll say something like unknown variable tax. So what if I want to use it out there? If I declare it outside of any function, then I don't need the bar here, then I won't get an error there. Then it's a global variable. So a global variable is one that's not defined inside of any function. A local variable is one that is defined inside of the function. All right, then a natural thing to say is, fine, I'll just make everything global. Makes it much easier. No, if you make everything global, you can get what are called side effects. All right, I'll give you an example. It's not a great one, but it's the one I typically use. All right, if I go into the intranet site, for Rankin, I can see information about me. All right, what I make, where I live, etc. And I can go in, some of that stuff I can change. Does that make sense? So if I move, when I moved from an apartment to a house, boom, okay? But although I can see my salary, I can't change it. Why? Well, probably because they know I'd add another zero onto the end of it, all right? Not after the decimal place, before the decimal place, all right? So there's only certain things that I can do. So some of the stuff is global to everybody. All right, anybody at Rankin can see certain things about me. Some things are local just to me. All right, and again, that's what we're going to be getting into. So there, it's global because it's defined outside of everything. All right, but you can get side effects. A side effect is sometimes intentional, sometimes is unintentional. If I say var and I define something at the top of my program, that means that anything in the program can change it. That's typically not what you want to have happen. You only want it changed where you want it changed. All right? So that is referred to as scope. The scope of a variable means, is it local or is it global? Right? In general, it's best to have all your variables local when you can and pass them from routine to routine. All right? If you want to force the user to write good code, that's what we're going to do. They've created something in JavaScript called strict mode. All right. I mentioned to you when we first started talking about JavaScript that JavaScript is both the best and the worst first programming language for you to learn. And it's for the same reason. Because if you forget to do something, JavaScript takes over. And it usually guesses, and it usually guesses right. When you say strict mode, all right, what you're saying is hey, some of these little shortcuts you have in there, don't allow them to happen. All right? And I don't even want to run through what it does, because what it does is it takes something you should never do, but JavaScript by default allows you to do, and it says, now that you've done this thing that you shouldn't do, now I'm going to catch it. So the bottom line is this. We're going to put that at the top of our JavaScript programs. That'll become line 1 now. Use strict inside of double quotes like that. That means we want to run in strict mode all of the time. And they did, I guess I wanted to show you that. They gave you what they called some best programming practices here. I don't want to read to you. But they're just things that good programmers naturally do. So we're going to follow these. All right? Sometimes it means you write more code. Sometimes the code may be a little bit more complex. But it's harder. When you write good code, it's harder for people to screw it up than if you write bad code. All right. Next is event handling. I did mention this to you before. We've looked at this a little bit. If you say, no, we haven't, well, then what do you think this is right here? Not there. That's an event handler that you see in the grayish yellow right there on line 8. That says when you click the button, you want that routine to run. That's an event handler. What's it reacting to? It's reacting to a click event. So these are the different types of events that you can deal with. All right. Again, this is one of those unnamed functions. We're going to go through all of this tomorrow. I think hopefully at least it'll make a little bit more sense to you. All right. I would strongly suggest that before you take your next test, which will be next week, that you probably could get by without reading Chapter 5. I don't know how you're going to without reading Chapter 4. So an event handler is a function that's executed when an event occurs. So imagine JavaScript is sitting there waiting for something to happen. And when certain things happen, it will react to those things if you have written code that tells it to react. So if I create a form and I put a button on it, and I don't put any code for that button, if I don't put any code, I can click the button, but nothing will happen. But if I put code in on a click event for a button, then when I click that button, what will happen? Whatever I coded. All right. Unfortunately, for this, when you start to go through this, older versions of IE did things differently than everybody else did. So you have to write it a little bit differently for IE. Okay? Now the chapter ends by going back over two things. One is this miles per gallon, and then there's that email list that they've talked about earlier. Now if you look up on the screen here, okay, now there's a form. And the idea is if you put something in here that's not numeric, it's going to catch it. If you put something in here that's not numeric, it's going to catch it. You may or may not be able to tell, but that miles per gallon was basically set up in a disabled or read-only mode. It's kind of like if you have a calculator and I type in 73 times 27 and it gives me the answer. I can't change that answer. Whatever it is what it is. All right? Did we have to do that? No, but it makes sense to do that. Any field that you don't want to allow the user to change, all right, you set it up like that so that it's basically read-only. All right? So look at the code for this. First thing they've done is they use the strict mode. Then they've done that alias. All right? Now, this looks a little bit weird. All right, right there, what you see in blue. It's an unnamed function. Calculate MPG assumes that when that function gets called, you will have the miles in there and you will have the gallons in there. All right? So you divide one by the other, it gives you MPG. Then they are doing a 2 fixed to just 1 decimal place. Then they're returning it. It's very similar to the stuff we've been doing, except that rather than doing everything in a main or in one function, we're breaking it up into multiple functions. And we're ending up putting this into an HTML form. It's kind of the bringing together. We've done the HTML, we've done the CSS, we're starting to do the JavaScript, but we're bringing all three together. All right. And here's another one. What are they doing here? Well, they're checking to make sure that you put in a number for each one of these and that you put in a positive number for each one of these. Usually, the hardest thing for people to understand is this one. This right here. What you see up on the screen kind of in a light blue. This onload. What that's doing, for lack of better words, is it's registering the functions. Just like you go to an event, you let them know that you're there, you give them your name, they cross your name off. Kind of we're doing that with a function. So what we're saying is, when we click the button called calculate, we want the process entries function to run. That's exactly what we're saying. We're not telling it to run. Please notice, there's no parens on here. When you register a function like that, you can register as many as you want to or need to. But when you register a function, never put parens. Because if you put parens, it calls the function rather than registering it. All right? We don't want it to be called. We just want the system. This is saying, hey, system, if you click that button called calculate, run that particular function. That's what it's doing. We're telling it what to do. We're not telling it to do it. All right? And then here is the associated, not a whole lot in here, but notice here they use disabled. All right? That disabled, again, is what grayed this out. All right? Take a look at that, because the one that we're going to write tomorrow is not going to be all that different from that. All right? Then they go through with this email list application and do the same type of thing. All right? I'm not going to go over that one at all. And that's it for this chapter. But before we finish up, what I want to do is, if you've got that handout that I gave you before the break, all right, we're not going to look at it yet. We're going to look at first why you might want to do that. All right, so here it is. This is not the one I gave you. You're like, well, why? Because what I did was I've got it here as one big routine. So everything is done inside of main. And after a while, when you've got an error, and it's especially if it's a logic error, it's much easier to figure out a logic error if you've got main broken up into a bunch of different functions, which is not what we have right now. All right? So this is a cheesy little calculator. All right? We're going to let the user enter the numbers 0 through 5. If they enter a 0, they're going to enter 2 numbers. And if they enter a 0, we're just going to tell them we want to quit the program. If they enter a 1, they'll add the 2 numbers. If they enter a 2, you'll subtract the second one from the first. If you enter a 3, you'll multiply the numbers. If you enter a 4, you'll divide the first number by the second. If you enter a 5, you'll divide the first by the second and get the remainder. Does all that make sense? All right? And if you enter anything greater than 5 or less than 0 or non-numeric, it won't take it. Very similar to the stuff that we've done. There's the first number we're inputting, the second number we're inputting, the answer. This is the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This, I wanted to be able to print out 37 plus 63 equals 100, as opposed to first number is 37, second number 63, answer is 100. So that's going to be the symbol. That's going to hold one of those symbols. All right? Now I'm putting this again into a loop. Notice up here I set selection equal to 1. As long as that selection is not equal to 0, keep doing everything that's in here. Where's the end of that loop? Right there, right at the end of the program. So what are we doing? We're telling the system to read in the first number and validate it. So if we get down to here, we put in a number. I didn't say it had to be positive. I didn't say a maximum. I just said it's a number. Then we do the exact same thing with a second number. Please look up on the screen. Would you agree, looking on the screen, that other than the fact that one of these says number 1 and one of these says number 2, would you agree they're the exact same routine? Would you agree with that? I would. So if you're a good programmer, you write it once and call it twice, as opposed to writing it twice. All right? And that's what we're moving toward. Okay. Then we're building that menu. So it first says enter a 0 to end the program, then enter a 1, enter a 2, etc. And it tells them to enter one of those things. Then we take that selection, what they just entered, and check to make sure that it's a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5. If it's not, we tell them to do it again. Then we come down here and notice this big ugly if. If it's a 0, you just basically are going to end the program. If it's a 1, you add. If it's a 2, you subtract. If it's a 3, you multiply. If it's a 4, you divide. If it's a 5, you modulo. This gives you the sign, 1 for a plus sign, 2 for a minus sign, 3 for an asterisk, 4 for a divide sign, and then we print it out. Really not a hard program. And if I run this, really kind of an ugly program as well, but it's functional. So I come through here, and I'll just keep the defaults, 10, 10. All right, so what do I want to do? Let's add them. There's a 1. 10 plus 10 equals 20. That's it. Then immediately it says, give me another number. 10, 10. If I want to stop now, I just put in a 0, and I'm done. All right, so that's pretty cheap and cheesy. Now, if you would, please pull out the handout that I gave you. And that's got this in it. So you'll notice the old program was about 140 lines. This one's about 220 lines, so it's gotten bigger. But I put more white space in it, and I put delimiters in here, so I put this at the beginning of everything. You don't have to do that. I did it to separate everything so you could see what was going on. All right? But if you notice in here, if you look up on the screen, and you look at this, main is now becoming what's referred to as a driver. Main is becoming a driver. All right? And the idea behind that is main should be like a supervisor. Rather than main doing the work, main should be calling different routines to do the work. So main here is calling input number, and input number again, show menu, and then depending on what happened here, it's either going to perform the operation and display it, and notice this. Probably the first time you've seen that. Main is calling main. That's actually got a name in computer terminology. That's a recursive function. That's a function that calls itself. Totally legit to do that. And if I run this, it looks virtually like the same exact one we just ran. Same thing we just saw, except now it's been broken up into different functions. So tomorrow what I'm going to do is, because I didn't have time to today, I'm going to rewrite this, and I'm going to rewrite this with those anonymous functions. And what we'll do is we'll have our page right here. Let's see. When we run this, we won't have this. This won't be our HTML page. We'll have a form. It won't look like a great calculator, but it'll look more like a calculator than what we have right now. Does that make sense? That's the plan. And tomorrow we will do that. All right? probably the first thing that we'll do is I will go in and I will give you the test review for chapters 4 and 5. All right. Then we'll do this, and even doing all that, we should still be done sometime no later than I would think 9:30. So you will have lab time tomorrow. Friday we will take the 2 tests like we did last week, the 2 written tests. I will review before the tests. All right. And then the rest of the period will be lab. Monday of next week, I'll give you another practice problem like I did before. I'll let you work on that if you want to. And then I'll go over it later. And then Tuesday of next week will be the test on chapters 4 and 5. All right. Then again, a week from today, we'll go over chapters 6 and 7. That's actually it for the JavaScript part. Because the following week, we go into jQuery. All right. Questions on anything? The rest of the period is yours.